The December wind howled through the Ardennes forest as Private Daniel Hutchins tried desperately to pull the bolt on his M1 Garand. His fingers, numb inside frozen gloves, couldn't make the metal move. The rifle bolt was frozen solid, welded shut by oil that had turned to concrete in the subzero cold. Around him, dozens of other soldiers faced the same nightmare, their weapons useless as German tanks rumbled closer through the snow. Back home, in a tiny workshop in Galesburg, Illinois, a 53-year-old gunsmith named Clarence Brewer was stirring a pot of whale oil and kerosene on his potbelly stove, completely unaware that his stupid little experiment was about to save thousands of lives and change the course of the war. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The first snow of December 1944 fell on Galesburg like a whisper, soft and deceptive. Clarence Brewer, who insisted everyone call him Clay, stood in his workshop behind the hardware store on Seminary Street, watching the flakes drift past his single dusty window. The workshop smelled of gun oil, wood shavings, and the faint metallic tang of spent gunpowder. Clay had been a gunsmith for 32 years, ever since he'd returned from the First War with a shattered knee and a newfound appreciation for the mechanics of firearms. His father had taught him hunting in the marshes along the Illinois River, where duck season meant standing waist-deep in freezing water before dawn, and where a gun that worked in summer could fail catastrophically when November ice formed on the barrel. Clay's hands, gnarled and scarred from decades of working metal, held a letter from his old friend, Raymond Cooper, who now worked somewhere in the Army Ordnance Corps, though he couldn't say exactly where. The letter had arrived 3 days ago, and Clay had read it so many times the paper was starting to wear thin along the folds. Raymond's words were careful, dancing around military censorship. But the message was clear enough. Rifles were failing in Europe, not from enemy fire, not from manufacturing defects, but from something as simple and devastating as cold weather. The standard Army gun oil, developed and tested in temperate conditions, was turning to sludge when temperatures dropped below 20 degrees. In the mountains and forests where American troops now fought, temperatures were plunging to 0 and below. Clay set the letter down on his workbench, next to a disassembled Springfield rifle that belonged to Harold Jensen, the bank manager. Harold wanted it cleaned and oiled before his son came home on leave. Clay picked up the can of Army-issue gun oil that Harold had brought with him, oil that was supposed to be the best modern chemistry could produce. Clay opened the can and dipped his finger in. Even at room temperature, the oil was thick, viscous. He walked to the back door of his workshop and stepped out into the December afternoon where the temperature had dropped to 15 degrees. He smeared a bit of the oil on a metal plate and left it on the back step, then returned inside to wait. 20 minutes later, he checked the plate. The oil had thickened to the consistency of molasses. He tried to wipe it off with his thumb and found it sticky, resistant. Clay carried the plate inside and set it on his workbench, staring at it with the kind of focused attention he usually reserved for examining firing pins. This was the oil that was supposed to keep American rifles functioning in combat. This was the oil that thousands of soldiers were using right now in conditions far colder than a December afternoon in Illinois. Clay thought about his own son, Marcus, who was somewhere in France with the Third Army. He thought about Marcus trying to work a bolt frozen solid while someone shot at him. The workshop was silent except for the ticking of the old regulator clock on the wall and the occasional pop from the potbelly stove in the corner. Clay walked to the wooden cabinet where he kept his hunting supplies, relics from decades of duck hunting in weather that would make a sensible man stay home. He pulled out a brown glass bottle with a handwritten label that read, Winter Oil, 1938. His father had taught him the formula, and his grandfather had taught his father. It wasn't scientific. It wasn't developed in a laboratory. It was simply something that worked, a mixture that stayed fluid when Illinois marshlands froze solid and duck blinds turned to ice palaces. Clay unstoppered the bottle and sniffed, the sharp smell of kerosene mixed with the faintly fishy odor of whale oil. It wasn't pleasant, but it worked. He'd used it on his Winchester pump shotgun for years, standing in freezing water before dawn, and the gun had never failed him. He'd never thought about it much. It was just something you did, like wearing wool socks or bringing coffee in a thermos. But now, holding this bottle in his workshop while snow fell outside and his friend's letter lay on his workbench, Clay began to think about it differently. He set up an experiment, The kind of informal test he'd done hundreds of times when working out problems with rifles that wouldn't feed properly or triggers that stuck. He took 3 metal plates, all identical, and applied different oils to each one. The first got a coating of Army-issue gun oil. The second got a coating of standard civilian gun oil from the hardware store. The third got a thin coating of his winter mix. He carried all 3 outside and set them on the back step, arranging them in a row like soldiers awaiting inspection. Then he went back inside, poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot that perpetually bubbled on the stove, and waited. The workshop had been his sanctuary for 3 decades. The walls were lined with tools, some inherited, some bought, some made. Racks held rifles in various states of repair, from antique muzzle loaders brought in by collectors to modern sporting rifles that needed only cleaning and adjustment. The workbench was scarred and stained, marked by the passage of thousands of guns through his hands. Clay had fixed rifles for farmers and hunters, policemen and target shooters. He'd repaired shotguns for bootleggers during Prohibition, though he never asked questions about why they needed their weapons to work reliably. He'd taught his son Marcus to shoot on a rifle he'd built himself from scavenged parts during the Depression. An hour passed. Clay checked his plates. The Army oil had solidified into something resembling axle grease. The civilian oil was thick and sticky. His winter mix remained fluid, thin enough to flow when he tilted the plate. He brought all 3 inside and set them on the workbench, then took them back outside. He repeated this process throughout the afternoon, checking every hour as the temperature continued to drop with the setting sun. By 6 in the evening, when the thermometer outside his window read 8 degrees, the Army oil was solid enough that he could barely scrape it off with a putty knife. His winter mix still flowed. Clay sat at his workbench under the yellow light of a gooseneck lamp and thought about what to do. He could write to Raymond, but what would he say? He could already imagine the response. The Army had chemists, engineers, entire departments devoted to developing lubricants and oils. They had testing facilities and budgets that would make Clay's entire year's income look like pocket change. What could one small-town gunsmith possibly offer that they hadn't already considered? His mix was old-fashioned, based on materials that were getting harder to find as whale oil became scarce. It probably violated a dozen military specifications. It was, in the words his wife Martha would use, a stupid idea. But rifles were freezing. Soldiers were dying. His son was over there somewhere. Clay pulled out a sheet of paper and began to write. His handwriting was cramped and awkward, the product of a man more comfortable with tools than pens. He explained the problem as he saw it, described his experiment, and laid out the formula his grandfather had used. He tried to keep his tone respectful, acknowledging that he was just a small-town gunsmith who probably didn't understand the complexities of military procurement and testing, but he also didn't soften his conclusion. The current oil was failing. His mix worked. If someone wanted to test it, he would send samples. He sealed the letter and walked through the snow to the post office, arriving just before closing. Margaret Wilson, the postmistress, took his letter and raised an eyebrow at the address. She'd known Clay since they were children, had watched him come back from the First War with a limp and a haunted look that took years to fade. She didn't ask questions, just stamped his letter and promised it would go out on the morning train. Clay walked home through streets where Christmas decorations hung in windows, incongruous and bright against the news from Europe that grew darker each day. Martha was making dinner when he arrived, the kitchen warm and steamy, smelling of pot roast and potatoes. She looked up from the stove, saw his face, and knew he'd done something. After 28 years of marriage, she could read him like one of his rifles, could tell from the set of his shoulders whether he was satisfied or troubled. She poured him coffee and waited. Clay told her about the letter from Raymond, about the frozen rifles, about his experiment and his response. Martha listened, stirring gravy, saying nothing until he finished. Then she said, "They won't listen to you. You know that, don't you? You're not a scientist. You're not Army. You're just Clay Brewer from Galesburg who fixes hunting rifles." Clay nodded. "Probably true, but you had to try anyway." "I had to try." Martha set a plate in front of him, pot roast and potatoes and carrots, food that was getting harder to find with rationing, but that she somehow still managed to produce. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from decades together. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Galesburg in white, beautiful and cold and indifferent. 3,000 miles away, in the frozen forests of Belgium, Private Daniel Hutchins was learning exactly how cold could kill you without firing a single shot. He'd been in the Ardennes for 6 days, ever since his company had been rushed north to reinforce the line after German tanks broke through in what everyone was calling the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans had attacked during the worst winter Europe had seen in decades, and the cold was proving as deadly as enemy fire. Daniel's feet were numb inside boots that never dried. His hands shook constantly, even when he wasn't scared, which was almost never anymore. But the worst part, the part that woke him in the middle of the night in whatever frozen hole he was sleeping in, was knowing his rifle might not work when he needed it. The M1 Garand was supposed to be the best infantry rifle in the world, the weapon that gave American soldiers a decisive advantage. It was semi-automatic, gas-operated, fired a powerful .30 caliber round, and could be reloaded quickly with 8-round clips. But all of that meant nothing when the bolt wouldn't move. Daniel had watched 3 men die 2 days ago when their rifles jammed during a German attack. They'd tried to retreat, but the Germans had machine guns. It wasn't heroic or glorious. It was just stupid, dying because your weapon turned into a metal club. Daniel's squad leader, Sergeant Frank Kowalski, had spent yesterday afternoon teaching everyone how to urinate on their rifle bolts to melt the frozen oil. It worked, sort of, if you could manage to urinate in sub-zero weather while under fire, and if you didn't mind the smell, and if you didn't think too hard about what you were doing. They had also tried heating bolts over small fires, which worked until the metal cooled again. Some men had stopped oiling their rifles entirely, which meant the metal parts ground together and wore down, and rust started forming almost immediately. There was no good solution, just a choice between bad options. Sergeant Kowalski was from Chicago, a South Side bricklayer who'd been drafted in '42 and had somehow survived North Africa and Sicily before landing on Omaha Beach. He was 27 years old and looked 50, his face weathered and hard, his eyes carrying the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. He gathered the squad in a bombed-out barn on a morning when the thermometer read -5, their breath-forming clouds in the frigid air. "Listen up," Kowalski said, his voice rough from yelling orders and breathing cold air. "Battalion says they're working on the oil problem. Some genius back in supply thinks they can fix it. Meanwhile, we got Germans a mile away who want to kill us, and our rifles are popsicles. So here's what we're going to do. Every man checks his bolt every 30 minutes. I don't care if you're sleeping, eating, or taking a shit. Every 30 minutes, you work that bolt. Keep it moving. If it starts to stick, you deal with it immediately. We can't afford anyone going into a fight with a frozen rifle." "Sarge," called out Private Eddie Morrison, a kid from Tennessee who'd lied about his age to enlist, and was probably still only 17. "What if we just kept the rifles inside our coats? Body heat might keep them warm enough." Kowalski shook his head. "Then the moisture from your body freezes on the metal, makes it worse. Trust me, we tried that in Sicily during the winter campaign. Same problem, different cause." Daniel raised his hand slightly. "What about keeping them dry? I mean, really dry, no oil at all? Then they rust and seize up from friction. Metal on metal, no lubrication, parts start to grind. You might get a few shots off, but then you're done." Kowalski looked at each man in turn, his gaze steady. "There's no magic answer here. We just deal with it until someone smarter than us figures out a fix. Until then, we survive." Questions? Nobody had questions. They knew Kowalski was right. You survived however you could, and you hoped someone somewhere was working on a solution. Back in Galesburg, 3 weeks had passed since Clay sent his letter. He'd heard nothing back and had started to accept that Martha was right. Why would the Army listen to him? They probably got hundreds of suggestions from well-meaning civilians who thought they could win the war with their clever ideas. His letter was probably in a file somewhere, if anyone had bothered to file it at all. Life went on. He fixed rifles, sold ammunition, listened to the radio news about the desperate fighting in Belgium. Every day he expected a telegram about Marcus, and every day he was relieved when it didn't come. Then, on a gray morning in early January of 1945, Raymond Cooper walked into his workshop. Clay looked up from a Springfield he was cleaning and stared. Raymond was wearing an Army captain's uniform, looking oddly formal and out of place among the gun racks and workbenches. He was carrying a briefcase and wearing the kind of serious expression that meant official business. They'd been friends since childhood, had hunted together in the Illinois marshes, had gone to the same one-room schoolhouse. Raymond had always been the smart one, the one who went to college and studied engineering, while Clay stayed home and learned a trade. But they'd stayed friends across the years and miles, corresponding regularly even after Raymond joined the Ordnance Corps. "Ray," Clay said carefully, wiping oil from his hands with a rag. "This is unexpected." Raymond set his briefcase on the workbench and looked around the workshop as if seeing it for the first time, though he'd been there dozens of times over the years. "Got your letter," he said. "Took it to my commanding officer. He thought I was crazy. Said no way some hick gunsmith from Illinois had figured out something our chemists missed. So I made him a bet." "What kind of bet?" Raymond opened his briefcase and pulled out 2 metal plates, both coated with oil. First plate has Army-issue gun oil, fresh from the factory. Second plate has a batch I mixed, according to your formula. I made it myself in our lab. Had to search half of Washington to find whale oil. Took these plates outside last night when the temperature hit 18 degrees. Left them for 6 hours. He held up the first plate. The oil was thick and gummy, barely moving when he tilted it. Then he held up the second plate. The oil flowed freely, thin and clear. "Your mix works, Clay. It works better than anything we've tested. My commanding officer wants to know if you can produce it in quantity." Clay sat down on his work stool, suddenly feeling very old and very tired. "Ray, I'm one man in a workshop behind a hardware store. I don't have a factory, I don't have equipment, I've got a mixing pot, some bottles, and a reputation for fixing old hunting rifles. The Army needs gallons of this stuff, probably thousands of gallons. I can't do that." Raymond sat on the edge of the workbench, his face serious. "I know. But what you can do is teach us. Give us the exact formula. Tell us your process. Help us understand why this works when our fancy chemical mixtures don't. The Army will handle production. We've got facilities, contracts with oil companies, distribution networks. What we need from you is the knowledge." He pulled a folder from his briefcase and set it on the bench. "This is a contract. Army wants to pay you as a civilian consultant. $500, which I know isn't much, but it's what we can authorize quickly. More importantly, it gives you clearance to work with our chemists, to oversee testing, to make sure we get this right." Clay opened the folder and looked at the papers inside. Filled with military language and legal terms he barely understood. $500 was actually quite a bit, more than he'd make in 3 months of gunsmithing, but that wasn't what made him pick up the pen Raymond offered. What made him sign his name on the dotted line was the thought of Marcus, somewhere in Europe, trying to fight with a rifle that wouldn't work. What made him sign was the image of Private Daniel Hutchins and 1,000 other soldiers he'd never met, dying because of something as stupid as the wrong oil. "How fast can we do this?" Clay asked. "That's why I'm here instead of just sending a telegram. I've got a car outside. There's a train to Washington tonight. Pack a bag. Bring your mixing equipment, your bottles, whatever you need to show our people how this works. We've got a week, maybe less, to get this into production and ship to Europe. Men are dying, Clay. Your stupid little experiment might save a lot of them." Clay looked around his workshop, at the rifles waiting for repair, at the life he'd built over 32 years. Then he thought about his son. "Give me an hour to close up the shop and tell Martha. Then we'll go." The trip to Washington was a blur of trains and military vehicles, of showing credentials at checkpoints and being hurried through corridors filled with officers and civilians, all moving with the frantic energy of a nation at war. Clay, still wearing his work clothes because he hadn't thought to pack anything better, felt completely out of place among men in uniforms and suits. But Raymond guided him through it all, and by late the next afternoon, Clay found himself in a laboratory at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, facing 3 Army chemists who looked at him with barely concealed skepticism. The senior chemist, a thin man named Dr. Richard Paulson, who wore thick glasses and had the air of someone who'd never been outside a laboratory, examined Clay's bottle of winter mix as if it were a specimen of a particularly uninteresting insect. "This is your formula, kerosene and whale oil, that's it?" Clay nodded. 3 parts kerosene to 1 part whale oil, mixed at room temperature, strained through cheesecloth to remove any solids. Let it settle for 24 hours before use. My grandfather used it for 60 years. Never failed. Dr. Paulson set the bottle down with a faint expression of distaste. "Mr. Brewer, I appreciate your intentions, but I have to tell you that this is chemically unsound. Kerosene is far too volatile to use as a gun lubricant. The flash point alone makes it dangerous. Whale oil is inconsistent in quality and becoming increasingly difficult to source. We've tested dozens of synthetic compounds that are superior in every measurable way. Except, they don't work when it's cold, Clay said quietly. Dr. Paulson's face flushed slightly. Our compounds work perfectly well within their design parameters. The problems in Europe are due to field conditions that exceed normal operational specifications. We're developing improved formulations that will address these issues. Raymond stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. Richard, with all due respect, we don't have time for development. We have rifles freezing right now, today. While men are trying to fight, Clay's formula works. I've tested it myself. Can you tell me why we shouldn't use it? Because it's primitive, Dr. Paulson said, his voice rising slightly. Because it's based on folk knowledge instead of scientific principles. Because it's the kind of thing frontier trappers used in the 1800s, not what a modern military should depend on. And because if we start using mixtures developed by amateur gunsmiths instead of trained chemists, we might as well go back to muzzle loaders and flintlocks. The room went quiet. Clay looked at Dr. Paulson and saw something he recognized, the pride of an expert who couldn't accept that someone without credentials might have an answer. He'd seen it before in gun shops where customers argued with him about their rifles, insisting they knew better even when the evidence was right in front of them. Usually, Clay would just nod and let them learn the hard way. But this wasn't about wounded pride or proving a point. This was about soldiers dying. Dr. Paulson, Clay said, keeping his voice level, I don't doubt that your synthetic compounds are better in most ways. I'm sure they're more consistent, more scientifically developed, probably cheaper to produce. But right now, in Belgium and France and wherever else our boys are fighting, it's below zero, and those fancy compounds are freezing solid. My mix doesn't. That's not theory or folk knowledge. That's observable fact. Now, you can explain to me why that doesn't matter. Or we can figure out how to produce this in quantity and get it to soldiers who need it. Your choice. Dr. Paulson opened his mouth, closed it, then turned and walked out of the laboratory. The other two chemists looked at each other uncomfortably. Raymond sighed and rubbed his face. Well, that could have gone better. One of the other chemists, a younger man named Lieutenant James Crawford, stepped forward. Sir, I'd like to run some tests on Mr. Brewer's formula. Just basic analysis, see what we're working with. If it works as described, we should understand why before we commit to production. Good idea, Lieutenant. Clay, can you walk them through your process? Show them exactly how you make this? For the next 4 hours, Clay worked with Lieutenant Crawford and his colleague, a quiet woman named Helen Drucker, who turned out to be one of the best chemists at the facility. Though she was only a civilian contractor because the Army didn't commission women as officers, Clay mixed batch after batch of his winter oil, explaining each step, answering questions about ratios and temperatures and settling times. Helen took notes with meticulous care, occasionally asking questions that showed she understood the chemistry better than Clay ever would. As the afternoon turned to evening, they conducted test after test, comparing Clay's mix to various Army formulations under different temperature conditions. The results were undeniable. At room temperature, the Army's synthetic oils performed slightly better in terms of viscosity and film strength. But as the temperature dropped, they thickened rapidly. By the time the test chamber reached 0 degrees Fahrenheit, the synthetic oils were barely flowable. Clay's kerosene and whale oil mix remained thin and fluid even at -20. When they tested actual rifle bolts, coating them with different oils and freezing them, the results were even more dramatic. Bolts treated with synthetic oil became almost impossible to operate. Bolts treated with Clay's mix worked smoothly. Lieutenant Crawford looked at the test results and shook his head in apparent disbelief. It doesn't make sense. By every principle of modern chemistry, this shouldn't work better, but it does. Helen Drucker smiled slightly. Sometimes the old ways are old because they work, Lieutenant. Chemistry is about understanding why things behave the way they do, but nature doesn't care about our theories. Mr. Zisty, Brewer's formula works because kerosene has a very low freezing point, and whale oil contains natural esters that remain fluid in extreme cold. It's actually elegant in its simplicity. Can we produce it in quantity? Raymond asked. Helen nodded. Kerosene is easy, we have plenty. Whale oil is the bottleneck. Current supplies are limited because of the war and reduced whaling operations. But I think we could substitute with certain fish oils or even some synthetic esters that have similar properties. We'd need to test, but yes, I believe we can scale this up. Raymond looked at Clay. How fast can we do testing? Give me 3 days, Helen said. I'll test 5 different variations using available substitute oils. If any of them match Mr. Brewer's performance, we can start production immediately. Those 3 days were the longest of Clay's life. He stayed at Aberdeen Proving Ground, housed in a spare office that had been converted into a sleeping room, eating in the officer's mess where he felt perpetually out of place among military personnel. Raymond kept him updated on the war news, which was grim. The Battle of the Bulge was ongoing, casualties were mounting, and weather conditions remained brutally cold. Every hour that passed was another hour that soldiers fought with unreliable weapons. Clay thought about Marcus constantly. He'd received a letter 2 weeks ago, carefully censored, saying only that Marcus was alive and with his unit somewhere in France. Clay read between the lines and understood that his son was in the fighting, probably in the same frozen forests where rifles were failing. He wondered if Marcus was using urine to melt frozen bolts, if he was risking his life every time he had to fire his weapon. The wondering was worse than knowing. On the 3rd day, Helen Drucker called Clay and Raymond to the laboratory. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes, suggesting she'd been working around the clock. But she was smiling. On the workbench were 5 bottles, each labeled with a complex chemical formula. I've tested all 5 variations under extreme cold conditions. 3 of them perform adequately, but this one, she held up the 4th bottle, matches Mr. Brewer's original formula almost exactly. It uses a blend of kerosene and menhaden fish oil, which is readily available from commercial sources on the East Coast. Production costs would be minimal, and we could have the first batch ready within a week. Raymond looked at the bottle as if it were made of gold. You're sure it works? I'm sure. I've frozen it, heated it, applied it to rifle bolts, and tested them in our cold chamber. It performs identically to the whale oil formula. Better, actually, because menhaden oil is more consistent in quality. Raymond turned to a phone on the laboratory wall and made a call. Clay couldn't hear the other end of the conversation, but Raymond's side was brief and pointed. Yes, sir. Confirmed. We have a working formula and can begin production. Request authorization to proceed on emergency basis. Yes, sir, I understand. Thank you, sir. He hung up and looked at Clay and Helen. You just got authorization from the Assistant Secretary of War. Helen, you're in charge of production. I want the first 500 gallons on a ship to Europe within 10 days. Clay, you're going to write up a field manual on how to use this properly. 1 page, simple language that any soldier can understand. Can you do that? Clay nodded. He'd never written a manual before, had barely written anything longer than a letter. But he could do this. He had to. The next week was organized chaos. Helen coordinated with 3 different oil refineries to begin production, working with chemists and engineers to scale up the formula from laboratory batches to industrial quantities. Clay worked with a young Army corporal who was a professional writer in civilian life, translating his practical knowledge into clear, simple instructions. They went through a dozen drafts, each one shorter and simpler than the last, until they had a single page that explained exactly how to clean a rifle, apply the new winter oil, and maintain the weapon in extreme cold. The first shipment left the port of New York on January 15, 1945, bound for Le Havre, France. 500 gallons of winter oil, packed in sealed metal cans, each labeled with instructions and marked as priority ordnance supplies. Raymond stood on the dock with Clay and watched the cargo being loaded onto a Liberty ship that would join a convoy crossing the Atlantic. The weather was cold even in New York, the wind cutting across the water, and Clay pulled his coat tighter around himself. Think it'll make a difference? Clay asked. Raymond nodded slowly. I know it will. Question is how fast we can get it distributed. Europe's a big place, and there are a lot of rifles that need this. 3 weeks later, Private Daniel Hutchins received an unexpected delivery. His company had been rotated off the front lines for a brief rest period, 48 hours, in a town that had been liberated 2 weeks earlier. Most of the buildings were damaged, but one warehouse had been converted into a supply depot, and word came down that there was something new for the rifles. Daniel and the rest of his squad trudged through the snow to the warehouse, where a harried supply sergeant was handing out small metal cans, each about the size of a shoe-polish tin. "New gun oil," the sergeant announced, reading from a sheet of paper. "Experimental formula, supposed to work in cold weather. Instructions are on the can. Clean your weapon thoroughly before applying. Use sparingly. Report any problems to your squad leader." Daniel took his can and examined it. The label was simple, just a parts number and a single line of instruction. For extreme cold conditions only. He opened the can and sniffed. It smelled like kerosene, sharp and pungent, nothing like the thick, almost odorless army oil he was used to. The consistency was thin, almost watery. It looked wrong. Sergeant Kowalski gathered the squad in the warehouse corner and held up his can. "All right, listen up. I don't know what genius thought this would work, but orders are orders. We're going to clean and re-oil our weapons using this stuff. Do it carefully. Strip your bolts, clean out all the old oil, make sure everything is dry, then apply this new oil, just a thin coat. Let's see what happens." For the next 2 hours, the squad cleaned their rifles with a thoroughness born of desperation. They used rags and brushes, heated water to dissolve the old oil, dried every surface until the metal shone. Then, carefully, they applied the new winter oil. It went on thin and spread easily, coating the metal with a layer so fine it was almost invisible. Daniel reassembled his Garand and worked the bolt. It moved smoothly, easily, with none of the resistance he'd felt for weeks. "Sarge," he called out, "I think this stuff actually works." Kowalski was testing his own rifle, cycling the bolt repeatedly, his face showing cautious hope. "Don't get excited yet. We need to see how it holds up when it's really cold." That night, the temperature dropped to -10. Daniel slept with his rifle beside him in the sleeping bag. Standard practice to keep the weapon from freezing solid. In the morning, he took it outside into the bitter cold and worked the bolt. It moved, not as smoothly as it would at room temperature, but it moved freely, no sticking, no resistance. He could feel the difference immediately. Around him, other soldiers were discovering the same thing, calling out in surprise and relief. Rifles that had been temperamental ice blocks for weeks now functioned normally. Sergeant Kowalski test-fired his rifle at a makeshift range, putting 3 rounds into a target 50 yards away, cycling the bolt between each shot without hesitation. He lowered the weapon and looked at it with something approaching reverence. "I don't know who made this oil, but I'd like to shake his hand. This might actually keep us alive." Over the next 3 weeks, as the Battle of the Bulge ground toward its conclusion and American forces pushed the Germans back, the new winter oil spread through the front lines. Supply clerks distributed it by the caseload. Maintenance officers demonstrated its use. Soldiers who'd been fighting with unreliable weapons suddenly had rifles that worked, that could be trusted, that wouldn't fail at the critical moment. The change wasn't flashy or dramatic. There were no newspaper headlines about revolutionary new lubricants. But in foxholes and forests, in ruined towns and snowy fields, American soldiers noticed the difference, and some of them lived because of it. Clay Brewer returned to Galesburg in late January, exhausted and disoriented by his brief glimpse of the military world. Raymond had arranged for him to receive a letter of appreciation from the Ordnance Corps, a formal document thanking him for his contribution to the war effort. Clay put it in a drawer and went back to fixing hunting rifles. The winter oil contract had been turned over to Helen Drucker and her team, who were now producing thousands of gallons and developing even better formulations for future use. Clay's role was finished. He told Martha about the trip over dinner, trying to explain what it had been like to work with army chemists and see his simple mixture turned into something official and important. She listened, occasionally asking questions, her face showing the kind of quiet pride she rarely expressed openly. When he finished, she reached across the table and took his hand. "You did good, Clay. Real good." In February, Clay received a letter from Marcus. It had been written 3 weeks earlier, somewhere in Germany, and the censors had been through it with their usual thoroughness, blacking out any specific details of location or unit movements. But Marcus had written something that made Clay read the letter 3 times to make sure he understood correctly. "Dad, I don't know how to tell you this except straight out. About a month ago, we got some new gun oil, special formula for cold weather. Works like a charm, keeps the rifles running even when it's below 0. Our lieutenant said it was developed by some gunsmith back in the States who figured out what the army chemists couldn't. I thought about you the whole time I was cleaning my rifle and putting on that new oil. I thought about all those mornings duck hunting when you made sure our shotguns were oiled properly for the cold. I wondered if maybe somehow you had something to do with this. I don't know if you did or not, and I guess it doesn't matter. But I wanted you to know that whatever you've been doing back home, it matters. It all matters. We're going to win this war, and part of the reason is people like you who do their jobs and figure things out and keep everything working. I'm proud to be your son. Clay sat in his workshop with the letter in his hands, reading it over and over until the words blurred. He didn't tell Marcus the truth, didn't write back, explaining that, yes, the winter oil was his formula, his contribution. It seemed too much like bragging, and besides, it wasn't just his. It was his grandfather's knowledge and his father's teaching and Raymond's belief and Helen's chemistry and the work of a dozen other people who'd turned a simple idea into something real. Clay was just the beginning of that chain, the person who'd mixed oil in a pot and thought to write a letter. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945. Clay listened to the radio broadcasts with Martha, heard the celebrations in the streets, and felt a relief so profound it made him weak. Marcus came home in July, thinner than he'd been but alive and whole. They went duck hunting that November, standing in the cold water of the Illinois marshes before dawn. And Clay showed Marcus how to oil his shotgun properly for winter conditions. Marcus watched his father's hands, gnarled and scarred, mixing kerosene and fish oil in an old bottle, and he smiled. "Still using the old formula, Dad? Still works, doesn't it?" "Yeah," Marcus said quietly. "Yeah, it does." They stood together in the marsh as the sun rose, father and son. And when the ducks came in, their shotguns fired flawlessly in the freezing air, exactly as they were supposed to. Clay thought about Private Daniel Hutchins, whom he'd never met, and Sergeant Kowalski, whose name he didn't know, and all the other soldiers who'd fought through that terrible winter with rifles that worked because someone had thought to mix kerosene and oil in a pot. He thought about Helen Drucker and Lieutenant Crawford and even Dr. Paulson, all of them doing their jobs, all of them part of something larger than themselves. The morning was cold and clear, and Clay's shotgun worked perfectly, and for that moment, everything was exactly as it should be. The official Army history of World War II, published years later, contains exactly 3 sentences about the development of cold-weather gun lubricants. It notes that winter oil formulations were developed in early 1945 to address weapons maintenance issues in extreme cold conditions. It credits the Ordnance Corps with rapid response to field requirements and notes that improved lubricants significantly enhanced weapons reliability during the final months of the European campaign. There is no mention of a small-town gunsmith from Illinois, no reference to kerosene and whale oil, no acknowledgement of the letter that started everything. Clay Brewer wouldn't have wanted it any other way. He lived another 23 years, dying in 1968 at the age of 77, still working in his shop behind the hardware store almost until the end. He fixed rifles for veterans who came home from Europe and Korea and Vietnam, never mentioning that he'd had anything to do with keeping weapons working during the war. When people asked, he'd just smile and say he was glad to help. Helen Drucker went on to become one of the first female chemical engineers hired directly by the Army, breaking barriers and proving that talent mattered more than gender. She never forgot the Winter Oil Project, the way a simple formula from a civilian had worked when sophisticated chemistry failed. She taught her students that the best solutions often came from unexpected sources, and that listening to experience was as important as understanding theory. Raymond Cooper retired from the Army as a colonel, spent his later years back in Illinois, and went duck hunting with Clay every season until Clay's death. They never talked much about the war or the winter oil, or the letter that brought them together on an urgent project. They just stood in the cold water, watched the sky, and were grateful that their shotguns worked properly. Private Daniel Hutchins survived the war, went home to Ohio, became a teacher, and never knew the name of the man whose formula kept his rifle working during the coldest days of his life. He taught history, and when he reached the unit on World War II, he always spent extra time on the Battle of the Bulge. He talked about the cold, the fear, the way small things could mean the difference between life and death. He never mentioned frozen rifle bolts or experimental gun oil, but he always ended that lesson the same way. Wars are won by soldiers on the front lines, but they're made possible by thousands of people you never hear about, doing jobs you never think about, solving problems you didn't know existed. Remember that. In the end, that's what the story of Clay Brewer and his winter oil comes down to. Not headlines or medals or recognition, but the quiet satisfaction of solving a problem, of helping when help was needed, of doing what you could with what you had. Clay mixed oil in a pot on his potbelly stove and wrote a letter, and soldiers lived who might have died. That was enough. That was everything. The winter of 1944 and 45 was one of the coldest in European history, and American soldiers fought through it with rifles that worked, because a small-town gunsmith remembered what his grandfather taught him about keeping duck guns functional in freezing weather. It wasn't a miracle or a technological breakthrough, it was just practical knowledge applied at the right moment by someone who cared enough to try. And sometimes that's all it takes to change the world.